The end of World War II brought swift and undeniable consequences for the infrastructure created during the war. The military rail networks, built with tremendous speed and scale to transport troops, equipment, and supplies across vast and often hostile territories, became relics almost overnight. These networks had been designed not for peace, but for a singular purpose: the rapid mobilization of military forces. But as the war concluded, these highly specialized systems, some newly constructed, others repurposed from civilian infrastructure, lost their reason for existence. By 1945, when the surrender of Germany and Japan marked the official end of hostilities, hundreds of thousands of miles of rail tracks, terminals, and specialized rolling stock that had once facilitated the war effort now stood idle. Built at a cost of billions in wartime expenditure, and often under extreme conditions, these military rail systems were part of the colossal wartime economy. Their fate was uncertain. On the one hand, they could not be simply discarded without considerable loss, yet they were ill-suited for civilian use in the post-war world. The initial reaction in the immediate aftermath of the war was one of stillness and confusion. Nations, already battered by the conflict, found themselves facing economic pressures that eclipsed the legacy of the rail networks. For example, in Germany, a country deeply ravaged by the war, the need to rebuild the civilian rail infrastructure was urgent. Yet the military rail lines, which had been integral to the Nazi war effort, were now seen as symbols of wartime aggression. The rapid demobilization of the military across Europe and the Pacific left vast swathes of railways abandoned and unused. The sheer scale of the rail systems, designed for the movement of heavy military machinery, troop formations, and vast quantities of munitions, was now out of step with the needs of peacetime economies. The task of managing these rail systems fell to a patchwork of military and civilian authorities. In Europe, the Allies quickly dismantled or repurposed much of the war-built rail networks. France, for instance, faced the difficult challenge of reintegrating its own pre-war rail system into a nation that had suffered extensive damage. While some military lines were decommissioned, others were converted for civilian use, though the process was slow and costly. The networks had been designed for high-capacity, high-speed operations, but they lacked the necessary features to serve the needs of civilian transport. They often ran through rural or industrial areas that were now either underdeveloped or sparsely populated. In the United States, military rail lines and installations were scattered across the country, with many in the South and Southwest, where vast expanses of desert had been used to train troops or transport supplies. With no immediate strategic need for these systems, the U.S. government ordered their dismantling. In some cases, tracks were removed entirely, leaving behind only traces of their once vital role in the war. In others, the rail lines were abandoned in place, deteriorating over time. The U.S. military, with its focus on the nascent Cold War, found that the cost of maintaining these systems was no longer justifiable. Despite the considerable investment, maintaining vast rail networks had become a financial drain. In the Soviet Union, the situation was more complicated. The Red Army had constructed an extensive network of military railroads during the war, particularly in Eastern Europe, to facilitate troop movements across the front lines. After the war, however, the Soviet government faced immense economic challenges. Much of the rail infrastructure in the Eastern Bloc had been left in ruins, with significant sections of rail destroyed during the final stages of the war. The military rail systems in these regions, many of which had been built for the swift transport of tanks and artillery, became increasingly redundant. The Soviet government, while eager to reintegrate Europe into its sphere of influence, found that the costs of rebuilding and maintaining the rail lines were prohibitive. The maintenance of military rail infrastructure posed a different set of challenges for the Axis powers. In Japan, the use of rail networks during the war was extensive, particularly in the transport of troops to various Pacific islands. With the collapse of the Japanese Empire, the country's rail system was heavily impacted by the destruction wrought by air raids and naval blockades. Many of the military lines, especially those in the southern regions of the Pacific, were abandoned as the economic focus shifted to reconstruction. Japan's Ministry of Railways was soon tasked with reconfiguring its networks, But the task was monumental, especially given the scale of devastation that had occurred during the war. The economic situation was further complicated by the global scarcity of materials. During the war, the steel required to construct military railroads had been in high demand, and after the war, that demand remained high. However, with the transition from wartime to peacetime production, it became evident that the supply of steel would not be able to keep pace with the need for rebuilding. Many of the materials left behind in abandoned military rail systems became scrap metal, salvaged for use in other industries. The dismantling of these systems, while contributing to the post-war economy, also marked a significant historical loss. What had once been vital infrastructure, critical to military dominance, was now seen as little more than obsolete scrap. The costs of scrapping or repurposing these networks were staggering. In some cases, entire sections of track were sold off to private contractors, who melted down the steel for industrial use. The strategic importance of these systems was not lost on military planners, but the scale of the work needed to remove or convert them meant that many were left to deteriorate. In particular, the vast rail yards and storage facilities built during the war became ghost towns, with their once constant activity now replaced by silence. The fate of the rail networks was also linked to the broader social and political changes taking place. In countries like Germany, where the military defeat had resulted in the dissolution of the Wehrmacht and the fall of the Nazi regime, the remnants of the military rail networks were viewed with a mixture of shame and pragmatism. The Allies insisted on the dismantling of many of these systems as part of the reparations process, though some sections were retained for their practical value in rebuilding civilian infrastructure. In other parts of Europe, however, the rail networks were simply abandoned, their utility no longer relevant. The rapid shift from war to peace created a vacuum, one in which the fate of the military rail networks was uncertain. What had once been considered a critical part of wartime logistics now sat idle, surrounded by the rubble of a war-ravaged world. The challenge, both for the countries involved and for the rail companies tasked with managing these systems, was how to handle the sheer scale of the infrastructure. Many of these networks were never fully dismantled. Some rail yards remained in place for years after the war, unused and decaying. Others were repurposed in ways that the original engineers had never intended, their tracks now serving functions they were never designed for. As the decades wore on, the historical significance of these systems began to fade, with only a few surviving examples of what had once been a testament to the scale and intensity of the war effort. In the United Kingdom, the situation was similar. Military rail lines were repurposed or sold off, while others were dismantled. The British government had to make difficult decisions about how to use its resources during the post-war period, and the focus was on rebuilding the civilian economy. Yet the British rail system, already struggling with post-war economic pressures, could not afford to maintain surplus military infrastructure. The rail networks, initially built to transport men and machines to the front lines, now faced a more uncertain future. The enormous investment in their creation, the massive mobilization of labor and materials, and the military strategic thinking that had guided their construction all seemed increasingly irrelevant as the world moved toward a new era. The networks that had once been essential to the war effort were now largely seen as a burden, their costs far outweighing any potential benefits in the New World Order. As the immediate post-war years turned into the early 1950s, the fate of the military rail networks continued to be shaped by a world in flux. While the larger geopolitical landscape was adjusting to the new Cold War realities, the infrastructure that had been constructed for war was slowly dismantled, repurposed, or left to decay. The economic and logistical pressures of the post-war era only made this process more complex. The vastness of these military rail systems, built for rapid and heavy wartime transportation, had become a burden in a world that no longer demanded such colossal structures. In Europe, the question of what to do with the remnants of military railroads was dictated by the need for reconstruction. Countries like France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, all heavily impacted by the war, sought to re-establish their civilian economies while dealing with the consequences of wartime devastation. The Allies, in particular, saw the remnants of the German military rail systems as symbols of an aggressive past, not something to be retained for future use. In many cases, the Allies supervised the dismantling of these networks, selling off parts for scrap metal or repurposing them for civilian transport. One of the largest tasks in post-war Europe was the rebuilding of the civilian rail infrastructure. Countries with extensive wartime damage, such as Germany, had to focus on restoring their national networks to normal operation. The vast military rail systems built by the Nazis had been intertwined with the civilian infrastructure, with tracks running parallel and converging in key cities and military zones. However, these networks had been designed for a completely different purpose. They were built for speed and capacity, capable of moving thousands of tons of military supplies and vehicles. These systems, constructed for a war economy, did not lend themselves to the civilian needs of the 1950s, when the focus was on rebuilding infrastructure for economic revival and peace. The political and economic landscape further complicated this process. Germany's division into East and West after 1949 meant that two separate policies emerged regarding the fate of the rail networks. In West Germany, under the supervision of the Allies and with the support of the Marshall Plan, much of the military infrastructure, including rail lines, was repurposed. While some were dismantled, many others were retained, but converted to serve civilian purposes. The networks that had once transported tanks and artillery now found themselves shifting freight and passenger trains across rebuilt cities. However, the transition was slow, and by the mid-1950s, the full repurposing of these systems had not yet been completed. In East Germany, under Soviet control, the story was somewhat different. The military rail systems built by the Wehrmacht during the war had been constructed with an eye on efficiency, but with little regard for the post-war civilian economy. The Soviet government saw the maintenance of these systems as essential to their goals of controlling the Eastern Bloc, and the massive scale of the German rail networks was partially retained. Nevertheless, these systems, often in disrepair, faced challenges in the years to come. With a focus on rebuilding military capacity in the region, the rail systems in East Germany remained largely focused on strategic transport rather than civilian use, a situation that would persist until the reunification of Germany in 1990. Across the Atlantic, in the United States, the situation was similarly complex. While the country had not seen the kind of infrastructure damage experienced by European nations, the U.S. military had developed an extensive network of rail systems in support of its wartime logistics. These included railroads for the transport of troops, supplies, and military equipment, many of which had been built in the early years of the war. By 1945, the need for these systems had dissipated with the collapse of the Axis powers. The U.S. military began the long process of decommissioning its surplus rail lines. Many of the tracks and equipment were dismantled and sold for scrap, while other systems were simply abandoned. However, there were some notable exceptions. In the post-war years, the U.S. military had to retain certain rail networks in strategic locations, particularly in the South and Southwest. Here, the railroads that had once been used for troop movements and transport of war supplies now served new, though less urgent, purposes. In particular, they played a role in transporting goods and materials for the burgeoning Cold War defense effort. The U.S. military's vast network of railroads was preserved, albeit in a scaled-back form, in response to the looming threat of Soviet expansion. The economic pressures of maintaining military rail networks were compounded by the global shortage of materials. Steel, a critical component in the construction of rail systems, was in short supply. Many of the railroads built during the war had been made with lower quality materials, as wartime demands had prioritized speed and capacity over long-term durability. By the early 1950s, when rebuilding efforts were underway, the cost of maintaining these older systems became a major concern for governments and military planners alike. In Japan, the situation was even more dire. The devastation caused by the war had left the country's civilian rail infrastructure in ruins, while the military rail systems, largely constructed for the transportation of troops and materials to Pacific islands, were either abandoned or destroyed. The Japanese rail system, once a symbol of industrial might, now had to be rebuilt from the ground up. The military lines that had once connected key military bases were now little more than twisted metal and burned-out stations. The Japanese government, focusing on economic recovery, prioritized rebuilding its civilian rail network, which had been a major part of the country's industrial infrastructure prior to the war. Military lines were dismantled or abandoned, with some sections repurposed for civilian use. However, the cost of rebuilding the system was immense, and it took Japan more than a decade to recover from the wartime damage. During this time, the military railroads, no longer necessary for the country's defense, became a symbol of the old regime, an unwanted reminder of the war and its aftermath. In the Soviet Union, the fate of the military rail networks was also tied to broader political and economic considerations. The USSR had constructed an extensive network of military railroads during the war to support its campaigns on the Eastern Front. After the war, however, the Soviet leadership found itself faced with the task of rebuilding a war-torn country while also consolidating its control over Eastern Europe. The military rail systems that had once played a vital role in the transportation of troops and equipment were now seen as an anachronism. In the years following the war, the Soviet Union began to phase out many of its military rail systems, replacing them with more efficient, civilian-focused infrastructure. Some of the rail lines, particularly those in the Eastern Bloc, were retained for military purposes, but much of the infrastructure was left to decay. The government faced a difficult balancing act. The cost of maintaining these extensive networks was high, but there were strategic reasons for keeping them operational. However, as the Cold War intensified and the Soviet Union focused more on nuclear weapons and missile systems, the importance of these military railroads diminished.